Hi, so I'm Patti Carr. I'm a TV writer and a board member, and I'm going to be asking questions of our panel here, who are going to introduce themselves now.
Hello, I'm Laurie Espinosa, Senior Director in the Contracts Department.
Hey, I am Manal Hammad. I am an agent in the TV group at Verve.
Hi, I'm Melissa Arbiter. I'm the Assistant Director of the Legal Department at the Writers Guild, and I've been handling a lot of the deal negotiations that we've been doing over the past year.
Right, great. Yes, Melissa is the best lawyer I've ever had, so everybody listen to Melissa. So starting off with the Contract 101, so why is it important to understand your contract? Why do writers need to do that? Don't we have people to do that for us?
Yeah. So
Well, having a contract is the best way to protect yourself as opposed to just a handshake. And it's also the way that the guild's able to enforce your rights under the contract. You just had an oral contract that would be a lot harder to prove. And in addition, it's important to understand your contract as well, because that's the best way to work with your reps. There are specific facts that your reps need to know in order to negotiate the best deal for you. For instance, if you have other projects you need carved out, or just what your priorities are. If your priority is a job title as opposed to your pay, those are the kinds of things that your reps need to know. So it's really working as a team is the way to get the best deal.
I would also chime in and say I think one thing that a lot of clients will say at all levels is they'll say, I have a really dumb question. Can you explain this to me when we're doing deals? And I would really, really recommend all of you, and I'll say what I say to my own clients, which is there are no dumb questions. You should know this inside out. It's really important to understand what you can do, what you can't do, what's allowed, and you should know. You should know, everything, how you're going to get paid if something goes wrong. We're in weird times right now. There's a lot of confusion. So from the rep point of view, I think it's really important. And I really, really, really encourage all writers to press on their reps to use the resources of the WGA to understand your contract.
right, you're your own best advocate throughout the process. That goes for negotiating your contract as well as enforcing it, probably especially enforcing it. So always call the contracts department as well if you have questions about something you've been offered and something or anything that's in the MBA.
Just the last point I'd want to make is that a lot of writers ask me if they can start working before they have a contract. That's usually the way that you get into trouble and don't get paid for your work. So make sure before you put pen to paper that you have closed deal terms that are in writing. If you're working on a pilot or a screenplay, make sure you've gotten that commencement fee before you begin writing. With series, it's a little different, but have those deal terms in writing before you go to work.
And the MBA does require that the company provide a written agreement within 10 days of commencement. So it is a requirement.
Okay, I don't know if you guys have anything. I would just add for myself as a writer, I did not know or feel comfortable asking my representatives for a very long time to give me those deal points in writing, or to give me the deal points while we were negotiating in writing, which they're sharing with each other in writing, and they can just as easily send you an email and tell you exactly what's going on. So instead of trying to listen on a phone call and jot stuff down that you don't understand, ask for them to just send it to you. That's my writerly advice. So, okay, so I think that's all good reasons to understand what's in your contract. What about negotiating? Can I negotiate for myself? I can't, and I wouldn't, but you guys can answer that question. Can someone do that for themselves? Basically, and is the Guild able to help people do that? When do you need to seek representation? What do you guys think about negotiating for yourself versus representation, and how the Guild can help?
I think.
Oh, sorry, Manal.
Melissa, you go ahead.
I think it's always better to have a representative who's experienced in what they're doing. And I mean, you should definitely be knowledgeable, but to have the level of expertise that you'd need in some of these deals, it's really better to have a specialist. The Guild has been helping writers negotiate overscale deals since April of last year, so a little over a year now. We've been doing it in a variety of ways. We've been starting with all the way from the time there's an offer, negotiating the deal terms, on our own. We've also, and then the long form as well. We've also been ghostwriters for certain writers that wanted to appear as if they were negotiating for themselves. We've worked in conjunction with agents and kind of we've had an agent and a Guild rep on a deal, which actually I think has been a really great experience because we kind of help each other, and two eyes are always better than one. And we've also assisted with different managers who've wanted help in negotiating during this time when there's been this agency action going on. So we can really help in a custom tailored way, just depending on your needs and desires.
And then from the representation point, I'm biased. I think that agents can make any deal better. And I think that we come from a place of personally advocating for you, whether that's with a showrunner, a creative, VA, back channeling. I think that we know what studios typically can do because we have other clients working at every place. So we know what the threshold is. We know what's fair. We know where you should land. And again, we are your personal advocates. So, if your rep isn't in there fighting for you to get what we know is fair, because we all talk, what'd you get here? What'd you get here? The studios that I cover, I know what they can do. It's really important to have the big picture, because they'll say this is the best we can do, and we can say no, it's not, and that's where we come in. And again, I'm very biased, but I think in this weird time that we've been in, the WGA has been a great resource, and we use the WGA. I use you guys. You guys have been great in very tough, confusing, very specific negotiations. But again, I think just having the personal advocate for you, we will make every deal better for you. That's our job.
Manal, would you talk a little bit about, from an agent's perspective, what a writer's leverage, where you get your leverage? Do you get it from your agency? Do you get it from your resume? What do you think?
I think every situation, every show, every client's different, right? Barring someone's personal financial situation at the time, given the time that we're in now, right? We're in unprecedented times. Earning money, being on a show, bringing money in is great right now, right? We're in a very uncertain time. But I think one conversation I have with every client is, where are we starting? Where do we want to go? And what's your line? And again, I like it when clients know exactly what their line is, and if you're willing to walk away. And what I say is we don't use walking away as a tactic. You have to be okay walking away, because they might not come back, and I think there are times when a title bump is they want you to repeat a title bump, and you have done that 2 times, and then it's just not okay. I'm a big believer in betting on yourself, but again, there's a lot of individual factors that go into the job, but you have to know what your line is, and I think you have to believe in yourself as a writer, and if you're going to walk away, you have to be okay with that they might not come back. But your best leverage is betting on yourself and knowing what you deserve and knowing what is an insult to you. And that's where we'll be helpful, right? With knowing what a studio can do, knowing what's unfair. Different people would take different things in different situations. But I love when my clients bet on themselves. If you're a client of mine or our agency and everybody, if with your reps, you should feel this way. We always want to bet on you. If you feel undervalued, you don't want to work on a pilot, a development project, or something with a bad taste in your mouth. Like, it really sets a bad place from the start, and that's not good for you, and that's not good for us. And getting staffed and getting a development deal are exciting things. And we're here to keep you in the realm of what we think is fair and what's reasonable. And if you're being undervalued for whatever reason, which happens quite a bit, bet on yourself. Betting on yourself is your best leverage, given all the circumstances working out for you. We will find you another job. We believe, and that's how your rep should come at you.
Great. I was hoping that you'd say your agent will get you another offer, because it's a lot of leverage in your offer.
Patti, I'll tell you what I tell my clients.
I'm a big proponent of that.
I can't guarantee you a job, but I can guarantee you that I'll fight like hell to get you in the position to get the job. We can only control what we can control. And that's what you want from your agent, right? You want your agent to fight like hell. I can't force a showrunner or a studio to buy something from you, but I can promise that every angle, everything that we can do, every way we can advocate, we will. You do your part, that's my part.
Great. Melissa, what do you think from the legal point of view? Do you have any feelings about leverage?
I think that knowledge is power, to be cliche. And, working your agents, like Manal said, she knows what the specific studios are willing to do. The Guild has a huge database of contracts, and now we're getting even more. And what's been really helpful for me in a lot of deal negotiations is when I feel like I'm being undercut, looking at what that studio paid someone, a writer of a similar level, and showing them that contract and saying, no, I know you paid this co-EP X dollars. That's what my writer deserves. They're of the same exact experience level. And that usually carries a lot of weight, and the studios seem to react well to that, had positive experiences. So we've had a lot of reps who will call us where we're not negotiating the deal, but they just want us to look in our database and see, and we'll give them kind of an anonymous summary of what we have. We don't have every contract on every show, but we have quite a bit, and that's always been useful in negotiating better deals.
That's great, and I hope for all the members who are attending this that it emphasizes how important it is to get the Guild your contracts. If you have, for some reason, opted out of that, you definitely want to opt in, because the more contracts they have, the more they can help all members get fair deals, and to share that information, with your agent, and so it's not even segmented by agency. As Manal said, she and her agency know all of their clients, but that doesn't mean they know every client in the business. And so if the Writers Guild has every writer's contract, that sounds like we all have more leverage. I don't know if you guys, do you have any other things to throw in on the leverage front? Because I'm sure everybody wants to know that. Everybody wants to know how they can, how do you get a better deal? But
I think there's a lot of power in no, and I think that writers knowing their value, and saying no. We work in Hollywood. When you say no, people sometimes want to work with you more. It's this it's this weird, funny thing that happens. But I'm just a big believer in that your value. Bet on yourself. When somebody knows you're going to take the job no matter what, and sometimes you are, it's your dream job, or it's the appropriate whatever. There's a whole bunch of different situations. But if it doesn't feel right in your gut, and your reps are saying you're being undervalued, and the WGA is saying you're undervalued, now again, everybody has a different financial situation. There's different times when you can do that and when you can't do that. But I'm a big believer in telling clients, bet on yourself, and that there's a lot of power in no.
All right, great. So our next area that we wanted to cover was the MBA versus your individual personal contract. I guess there's a certain amount of interplay there. We're all working under the MBA, but we also have our individual contract. So, maybe you guys, Laurie, did you want to kind of start and talk about that?
Sure. So the MBA, the minimum basic agreement, is a written contract between the guild and the signatory companies. So anyone who has signed that agreement. That agreement sets the floor. So nothing that a writer negotiates individually can undercut those minimums in the MBA. On the other hand, the writer's personal services agreement is the contract between the writer personally and the employer. So the MBA has a provision that says no individual writer can waive a minimum in the guild agreement. So you're always protected that way. I'm sure Manal or Melissa can tell you that your personal services agreement, the goal is to contain things that are more favorable than guild minimum, what we call above scale. This is one of the few industries where that it is common for labor to negotiate terms more favorable than in the collective bargaining.
Yeah, we will fight for as much as we can get on every chance that we can get. That's the fun part.
Melissa, do you have anything to add to MBA terms and how to get them clarified or enhanced or in your personal contract?
Yeah, I mean, definitely always call us if you have any questions. The collective bargaining agreement is so dense, and it's not always that easy to understand just by looking at the language. You always want to make sure you don't accept a term that is below minimum. And sometimes that happens just because of, ignorance as to the specific details in the book. So if you're unsure about anything or your rep is unsure, have them give us a call. We're also publishing our quotes on averages. We've been doing that past year on a periodic basis, and we're going to continue to do that. So that also helps you get a range of what we've seen in terms of the contracts we have for overscale. So you're constantly trying to make sure that you're not going down towards minimum, but going up as far as you can in an overscale manner.
Yeah, and that sort of goes to the issue of knowledge is power that Melissa mentioned earlier, that as long as it's important that you know what the minimum terms are, because you might not even know that there's something that's below scale in your individual contract. So again, knowing what's in there and contacting the guild to talk about what the MBA says is really important all during the process, during negotiations, as well as while you're working and even after.
Yeah, I mean, I can say again from my personal experience, I had not thought to take advantage of the guild's knowledge and of the MBA because I've worked in the industry for so long. I worked in broadcast and I felt like I knew what the terms were, and the terms were pretty common and known for a long time. But with the expansion of everything, everybody in the world getting into making content, you start getting into other venues that you're not familiar with. So the first time I turned to the guild was the first time I got a non-broadcast offer. And I thought, even though I'm pretty involved and pretty knowledgeable, I kind of wanted to know specifically what are the pitfalls, particularly, what have writers been experiencing with this specific company,
Yeah.
It wasn't Netflix, but let's say Netflix. Let's say you're doing your first deal with Netflix and you want to know, what has the guild had to fight for? What are the problems that have come up? And to me, one of the things that was very illuminating was how to enforce the MBA through the language that's in your contract, making sure that you're specifically wording your contract or acknowledging MBA terms or, in a certain way. And that I had legal representation that wasn't doing that and hadn't done that. And the guild helped me make sure that got done correctly. So I'm personally now a huge proponent of always calling the guild for your specific deal and at least understanding what's going on with that company right now, because can always be a lot of things that are, they're not in the news.
Right, and right now there's even a wider array of terms that could apply simply because things are now dependent on the particular platform, if it's on cable, if it's on network, and then if it's on Netflix versus Peacock. So there's just a ton of different terms that can apply, and it becomes even more critical to find out what you should be getting up front.
I was going to say, like, from our point of view, it's been very helpful to use the WGA as a resource because of different minimums for different streaming platforms. And I think a lot of people will they'll be really surprised when the script payment is a different minimum, and so, it's changing so quickly. And there's so many new platforms, and then it's like understanding span protection on how many episodes, and there's a lot of moving pieces, and so we are constantly educating ourselves, so we can be knowledgeable for the clients. And the WGA has always been a great resource for me personally because from, like you said, from Peacock to Netflix to Apple to Amazon, there could be different minimums and different things that they have to adhere to in broadcast versus streaming, and so it's even confusing for us. And so that's why the education process for writers and the resources that the WGA has are so crucial, because we're in a time in the business where it's changing so rapidly. And you may think you understand what the minimum is, but it's not. It's at this new place, so now it's different.
And even on the same platform, for example, even if it's Netflix, you might end up with two different minimums depending on the budget. So there's another layer of stuff to wade through.
And also the retroactively changing the budget afterward, right? And understanding, like, wait a second, this was low budget, and now in production it's high budget. So saying I'm owed money, and that's been one that I've seen on my end a few times, So very important to keep track of those changes and track what kind of show you're on.
Right. It's job security for us.
We need you.
Melissa, I don't know. Did you have anything that you wanted to add about that?
I mean, I think that covers most of it. It's especially in streaming, the formulas are so complicated. And I mean, when you assess what your residuals are going to be, even you need to know what the budget is. You need to know what your residual base is. You need to know the number of subscribers to your particular platform. And then depending on the platform, if it's Netflix, for instance, you'll get 150% of this base. But if it's Amazon, you're only going to get 100. And now if it's Apple, you're going to get 65%. I mean, it's really hard to keep all of the different formulas in your head and know what they are. So I think really relying on the Guild to educate you in that way is crucial in the streaming world, especially.
I agree. Okay, so I think we touched a little bit on minimums versus overscale. That's a thing everybody aspires to, overscale. So what is the difference? Why is it important? Who fights for our minimums? Who fights for overscale? I think that question is like in particular when you have a problem, when you've launched into something, and now you're going, wait a minute, they're paying me this way. Who do I turn to? The Guild, my reps, both. So, Melissa and Laurie, do you want to speak to that from the Guild's point of view?
Yeah, I mean, the Guild negotiates minimums every 3 years as part of collective bargaining. And then your individual deals, hopefully are overscale deals. And that would be your reps, which can either be your agent, your attorney, your manager, the Guild, or a combination of both. I think some of the things that writers have been particularly confused about lately is how to kind of assess what their episodic fee is in terms of minimums. And that's a tricky area because you don't know how many weeks you're going to be working, and it's part of why the Writers Guild negotiated something called SPAN, because with the short order phenomenon, people were getting paid less for working the same amount of time. I mean, SPAN's pretty complicated, but as of right now, the threshold for SPAN in the 2020 NBA that we just negotiated, it's people making $400,000 or less. I think, Laurie, you can tell me what it is for basic cable. I think it's slightly
375,000.
Not including script payments. Not including script payments.
Correct. It's just for your episodic fee. Nothing else tacked onto that.
In terms of enforcement, I mean, the Guild enforces both minimum and overscale. I think that was your question. But we do have a jurisdictional limit in terms of our arbitration tribunal. Right, Melissa?
Yeah, it's $400,000. So anything that's $400,000 or less that, you were not paid pursuant to your contract, the Guild can bring a claim and go after that. If it's residuals, that limit doesn't apply. That's only for initial compensation. But also just in terms of determining, what your fee would be with SPAN, you also need to know how many episodes are supposed to be in your project. There's different threshold and cutoffs for that. And Laurie, you can talk a little bit more about that. You're more of our SPAN expert.
Do we jump there now, or do you want to stick with our outline? It's up to you guys.
Oh, is SPAN farther down? I can only
A little
scroll
bit.
so far.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that we were going to talk about is the definition or the difference between Article 13 and Article 14. And I don't know, maybe that's too simple a thing, or maybe we do want to get into that now. SPAN is part of Article 14. I'm sorry? SPAN is a part of Article 14, which applies to writer-producers. Article 13, that essentially contains the minimums for particular pieces of literary material. So, for example, the minimum for a screenplay, the minimum for a story and teleplay, a rewrite or a polish. And it also provides the weekly minimums for writers that are employed as staff writers in television and for screenwriters who are working on a weekly basis. That's not something that happens all that often, but sometimes during production, writers are employed weekly. On the other hand, Article 14 is our provision that pertains to writers also employed in additional capacities, and that's the terminology we use. We also call it hyphenates, someone who is both a writer and a producer. And this is something in television that's very common for writers to be employed as writer-producers. So that article provides the terms and conditions applicable to story editors as well as writer-producers, including the minimum weekly compensation payable to those writers. So this is an area where writers often negotiate above scale in the form of episodic fees. And that's what SPAN, as Melissa mentioned, is designed to sort of shepherd into the new era where now we have a lot of short orders, as opposed to historically where we had network shows that had 22 episodes a season, and it was very predictable and regular employment. If you guys want to hear about SPAN now, I can go into it now.
Well, maybe we'll cover a little bit more about the minimums and the overscale. I have your contractual bumps. Are they enforceable? But I'm also curious from Manal. I think most people, when they're they have a contract, they've started to do a job, something's not right, they call their agent. I have heard from some writers that they have said, like, my agent told me not to call the Guild and not to make that kind of trouble with the studio. I don't think anybody on this panel advocates for that at all. But how do you go about enforcing something like that? And when do you involve the Guild?
look, it's my job to advocate for the client. So if they're not getting something, then I probably need to call and yell at somebody, right? Or maybe not start there, you know, like I'll call politely, but like if we're getting the runaround, you know, getting clients paid is really important, you know. I'm a stickler for that, you know. I'm a stickler for being proactive, for asking for paperwork and not waiting for a studio to send it, because if you're waiting for them to send it, then, you know, God help you, you know, when a show starts and you're staffed. And I tell people, give them 3 weeks, right? Give them 3 weeks. If we don't get the check in 3 weeks, I have put contract administrators at studios and payroll people on my phone sheet every day as a first phone call until a client gets paid. You know, like those are the lengths you have to go to sometimes, you know. You know, again, somebody works on a show, it's 3 weeks to get paid, they, you know, 4 or 5 weeks go, like that's unacceptable. And how common that is ridiculous. So, you know, as a rep, like that's my job, is to then call and go yell at somebody, you know, or you know, do we need to get the guild involved to get the place in trouble? Sure, whatever gets it done, you know. I don't understand the not calling the guild thing. Like my job is to get a client paid, you know, and if they're working on your show, pay them. And I know that I asked for all the paperwork before you sent it to me, and I know that we've double checked it and triple checked it and it's in. So those are the steps that I personally take, you know, because I don't want to be working for 5 weeks without a paycheck, you know. That's not fun. So again, that's our job. I think the WGA is super helpful. I just think some studios, I don't know, I honestly couldn't tell you why it takes them so long and what's going on. And these people will say, like, we're working on it. And I'm like, that's an unacceptable answer. You know, how can I as a rep go back to my client and say they're working on it? You know, that's so I'm a big proponent in using any source that we can. The WGA, like I don't care about the studio or what I care about getting my client paid. That's a huge part of my job. Half of my job is being a bill collector, you know, and chasing people down for money. And it's frustrating. It's really, the processes at these studios is very frustrating for clients. So again, it's important for us to understand that process and for writers to understand that process. And, you know, I'm just the kind of agent that I will make you my first phone call every day until you give me an answer. I will send a messenger to go pick it up. I will, you know what I mean? We will do whatever we have to get someone paid. And sometimes you have to do that, which is not fair and it's ridiculous. But that's what reps should be doing.
I wonder if all reps feel exactly that way. I mean, sometimes I think it's helpful to have the guild step in, and some agents are more comfortable with that, and a lot of writers are more comfortable with that because we're not as concerned with maintaining the relationships, you know, in terms of just worrying about getting another job, worrying about staying on in the next season of the series. So sometimes it is helpful to let the guild do the heavy lifting there.
Yeah, I think I worried less about that because it's like usually we're in the right, you know. So again, I will be polite. I won't start off yelling. But like if I need to raise hell to get a client paid, again, who does not want to get paid for 5 weeks when you're working? That's a very normal concern, I think. And I think any student would do that.
I've heard from the studios, because I've actually had this conversation, and they said that some writers don't want to get paid right away. I've actually been told that they like it when they like their script payments to all come at one time, far later, maybe after production. They like that. That's what I was told.
I can tell you, I have never ever heard a single client ever say that to me, or a colleague at Verve ever. That has never come up ever. And I can even go back to when I was an assistant coordinator and working for other agents. I have never heard that before.
You never had a client call up and say, stop, the checks are coming too quickly. Do I have to go to the bank every day?
You know what? We're having a serious problem with the mail right now, too, by the way. You know, like people's checks coming in right now, it's really ridiculous. So when a studio is late right now with what we have going on with the mail, it's especially frustrating and especially important to make sure. Look, I will have my assistant have a daily. Did they mail out the check yet? The check is mailed out. When are we getting it? Like, those are the steps that you have to take. You shouldn't have to, but again, I've never heard anybody say they didn't want to get paid in this industry or another.
In terms of contacting the guild, I mean, one of the things that we can do is file lawsuits in the legal department. And a lot of times that if a studio is really dragging its feet, that's how we get their attention, and all of a sudden the check is paid. So they have to notify their carrier. A lot of times there's a lawsuit, and if it's something they're just going to pay anyway, it's sometimes what they need. I wanted to address Patty's question about the fear factor in reaching out to the guild on certain claims. And again, this is another benefit of us having your contracts and your invoices, is that we can affirmatively police. So it's becoming more, it's not as obvious that the writer reached out to us, because we are doing some affirmative policing on our own. And by having that, the studio doesn't know, is this something the guild just noticed through the information they're obtaining, or did the writer reach out to them? And that provides some protection and comfort to a lot of our members who are a little bit more apprehensive of going up against the studio.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say also that my experience with the guild and enforcing contracts and sort of our late pay campaign, to speak to that common scourge. The idea of it going to the department handling late pay and them just billing has been very effective. and I don't think anybody that I've worked with creatively is even aware that it's happening. So it doesn't seem to be going up on the, my picture's not next to their cash register as, watch this one, she'll ding you for late pay. And I've gotten checks, and the guild has gotten checks for a lot of writers who have gotten paid late. And I think that's a good method of enforcement, because if it costs them more to pay late than it does to pay on time, then they'll save money by paying on time. I'm sure there's a lot of other, we were really under the overscale and the minimums, and there's so many things in that area. Laurie, I don't know if you wanted to talk about pension and health contributions on how those are made and enforcing that.
Sure. Basically, pension and health contributions are made on all writing compensation. When it comes to writer-producers, the hyphenate television writers we talked about, there is a weekly minimum on which contributions are made. So that overscale amount, that episodic fee, or the amount that could be attributed to producing money, that is not subject to contributions. And just a note about the contributions, they're now a total of 22% of compensation. So we just got a substantial increase in pension contributions in this MBA, as well as a new parental leave payment fund. I guess that's what it's called. It's a brand new contribution of 0.5% on top of everything else that can give writers a benefit, even if they're not on staff, if they are adopting a child or having a child. And so it's a very unique new benefit that we just negotiated in 2020.
Great. Melissa, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
I mean, you had asked previously, and I didn't get around to answering it, about whether contractual bumps are enforceable. This is something that a lot of writers have reached out to us about when they find out that, they're being re-upped for the next season of their show, but the studio tells them all of a sudden, sorry, we just don't have the budget to pay you what we said that we were going to in your contract. It's not very common. Usually studios tend to honor what those contractual bumps are, but it's important to know that they're the studio's option. Basically, if they pay you what they're saying that they will pay you the second season or third season, you're locked in with them. It's not your option. You can walk away. That's your choice. If they aren't going to honor what they said that they were going to pay you for a following season, you can find a different job. But they don't have an obligation to pay you that amount the following year. And that's something important just to be aware of. I do find that something they do honor, but there are circumstances where they don't, and writers come to us really disappointed when they hear that, wait, this wasn't a guarantee for me, and it's not. So it's just something to be aware of.
That's
Yeah,
another.
that's another.
I was
Go
going to
ahead,
say,
Pat.
from an agent point of view, that's another potential raise hell situation, right? Where an agent can be helpful. And again, that's a knowing your value. You might just have to get up and walk away. But the burden gets put on the writer. Well, we love you. We just don't have the money. Like, they find the money. They can find the money when they want it. You know, they magically find it. Every time, magically they'll find it.
Right, and that also goes to the language of a writer's contract, and this again is the personal services agreement. That language can be helpful or harmful depending on what it says, and so that's another reason why it is helpful to have both your agent and the guild take a look at that language before you sign the agreement.
The studios will always try to be tricky in the contract. You know, they'll always try to give themselves an out. And again, this goes back to what we talked about at the beginning. That's why it's really important to understand. And it's really important to have good representation who is paying attention to the details and not just rushing through your deal. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories from other writers that I don't represent where clearly their deal was rushed through, you know, and then they get caught off guard with something like that because something wasn't guaranteed, or it's really disheartening when you get there because it's too late almost. You know, you have to really pay attention to the details before you say yes.
Right, absolutely. And I think we covered this, but maybe we didn't cover it clearly, if I don't remember us clearly saying it. But when you talk about having your deal done and in writing, and I don't know any writer who's ever started work, certainly in television, with a long form contract. You're talking about a deal memo that has the significant points in writing. And that's another reason I think if writers are waiting for their contract to come to sign it, and they think that's their written deal and that's the enforceable deal, that's not the case, right? That's not what you need to start. And what you need in writing, what a writer should see in writing, is their deal memo.
Exactly.
Am I right? Tell me I'm right.
You are absolutely right, Patti. We can enforce a deal memo.
However, companies will try to sneak a whole bunch of extra things once you get the long form.
Right. No, absolutely. And I would say that's something, you know, I try to be super proactive in my career at this point. I try to understand all these points. I'm never going to sit down and read that long form. That's just not going to happen.
It's a lot. It's a lot, but Laurie, you're completely right. We will go back and forth and agree to a lot of points, and sometimes it could be a couple months later before we get the long form. And there'll be all kinds of things you didn't agree to that are snuck in there. So again, that's where having a really thoughtful rep, using your resource at the Guild is really, really important, because so much time has gone by and it's the exclusivity. And again, it's these things that might not affect you right away, but they're going to affect you in years 2 and 3, or in what you're allowed to do in between seasons. And it's more common than not that the stuff will get snuck in there. So that's where lawyers, the WGA agents are super helpful.
Yeah, those standard terms and conditions just get longer and longer. It's the 40 pages at the back of the contract that they stick on that you haven't had a chance to negotiate any of.
Right. Okay, so it's a good transition from unexpected things happening to COVID-related concerns. Didn't see this coming. I mean, everybody is. I think everybody's gotten into contracts. I'm sure agents have as well in the past 5 months. I'm not even sure what I need to cover at this point. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to affect me. All the standard deal terms are kind of like, what does that mean? Nah. In this circumstance. So what are some of the things that writers should be aware of right now you know, what are the kind of critical things? I don't know, Melissa, do you have some
Yeah, I mean,
help us
obviously,
help?
there's a provision in every contract called force majeure, and it basically allows the studios to terminate your contract if there's, well, they like to phrase it very broadly in their agreements, and basically it's like any interruption. Trying to negotiate that force majeure language is important. Recent California case law, though, has been on our side. So even if you wind up having this force majeure clause that says, hey, if it's any inconvenience to the studio, we can terminate your agreement, California law actually says that it has to be an event that renders your job impossible or unreasonably expensive. And when you're a writer, in times of COVID, you can still work. We've seen that in the industry. In fact, writers have been the only ones who have been working for the most part. You can work remotely. So we've actually been having a lot of disputes over these force majeure clauses. So when you're negotiating your contract at the outset, it's better to try to stick to those terms, that impossible and unreasonably expensive, to the extent you can, just so you don't have to go through and have a dispute later on about their overly broad language. I mean, fortunately, you have California law on your side, but it's just an additional hassle. So I think right now, making sure you perfect that language in your long form is important. It's something in the past that a lot of attorneys have kind of glanced over because it's like, oh, this is never going to happen. But we're in that situation right now. The other thing is that episodic orders are so uncertain right now. They keep changing. So getting paid based on an episodic fee, while that used to be, there's almost a stigma associated with getting paid a weekly fee. I've had clients who've said, no, I'm at a certain point in my career where I really need to get paid episodic. Well, in times of COVID, a weekly fee is better for you because you know what you're going to make every week, and it doesn't matter if your 22 episode order is now 15 episodes. You're going to get paid for all of the weeks that you worked. So I'd say trying to negotiate a weekly fee in times of COVID is really important. And if you're unable to do that, having a guaranteed episodic, minimum number of episodes that you're going to get paid for, regardless of whether or not they're produced, is another thing that you can try to do. It's an uphill battle, I will tell you, because the studios are well aware of the fact that the number of episodes are in flux. But, if you can use your leverage to get that, that's probably one of the most important things that you can be working on.
I think also one thing to add, Melissa, and like one thing we've experienced with the force majeure is making sure that the clause that you put in the contract that every writer gets treated the same, because somebody's rep might negotiate the language in a force majeure, and this I had this happen during this time. So you want to make sure that you're having your agent or your lawyer make sure that there's a clause in a contract where every writer gets treated the same.
Yeah, favored nation. That's a good idea.
Yeah. So, and specifically on the force majeure, because that way certain people, it's just really important. And again, it came into play in a situation during this time, which has been very, very tricky, So to deal with, again, we talk about writers get to a certain level where they're all episodes produced. Well, we're in an area where they might not produce any. So what does that mean? What does that mean for your guarantee? So it's been really tricky to figure out writer rooms going, but production not happening. And I can tell you from an agent point of view, every studio has been handling it and saying different things and saying they cleared it through their legal, and then we'll call the WGA, and the WGA will say no. And then they're like, no, that's not what we said, And so it's almost a moving target right now to figure out what's enforceable and what's not. Dealing with issues that I've never seen in my career thus far during this time. So the WGA has been a great resource to us as an agency on that. And we certainly come to you guys. I don't think they're allowed to do that. So, and I think we're all figuring it out together.
Yeah. And one other thing I want to mention is unpaid hiatuses. That's been something that's been happening in a lot of series. And we've been taking the position that a lot of times they'll send their staff home, but they're still being assigned scripts to work on while they're no longer, in the room. The Guild's position is that means that, you still need to get paid your weekly fee. If there's somebody writing a script at home, you get paid your weekly fee. And that's been a fight we've been having a lot recently with the studios, generally with good success. So if that's happening to you in your room, give us a call.
Also, I will say, like, when we've had clients in rooms where there was very common at the beginning of COVID from one place in particular. And so what we tried to do as reps is we tried to get all the writers to band together, and pens down. I think it's also really important in these tricky times for writers to stick together, because if it's one writer boycotting and every other writer is saying yes to something that's tricky, you're probably not going to get the studio to move. But if you all say no, we're sticking together, our guild is saying no, this is not right, be surprised how quickly they move. So I would recommend that.
Well, I don't think we'd be surprised at the Writers Guild how collective action yields results. So it's always a good idea. I'm just going to add to this question on the COVID concerns, because I'm sure, again, everybody's having questions that we just never have had before. But I just wonder if any of you have thoughts on what we're anticipating, or certain things that we're anticipating or wondering how we're covering, how our MBA covers coming up, particularly, in shows that have productions pushed. There's a lot of things that we're supposed to start that haven't started. You're starting to butt up against the next season. If you're on a show, for example, and you're like, my season normally ends here, and now I'm starting to end in when I start the next season. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen if we do start, but we've pushed? And I know we've had other conversations with writers about, is a season defined? Do we know how many episodes? Can they say it's the same season? A lot of the kind of streaming issues coming to the broadcast site. So I just wonder, maybe from each of you a little bit, what are you worried about? What are you anticipating? And are there things that you're, we should get ready for?
I'll jump in. I think I'm worried about the episode orders in production, right? Like, we're inching back into production. I think we're all hoping for the best. It's kind of an unknown right now. So, I do get worried for clients who, when we negotiated their deal, they're in multiple years or whatever it is, we knew, okay, you're going to do 14 episodes at this rate, and then this is when you're going to be on hiatus and you can work on this other thing, is that everything's being pushed. And the financial hit of, instead of doing 14, you're doing 8, and you probably planned for that money to come in because we negotiated all episodes produced. And again, it's an unprecedented time. So we're figuring that. I'm really worried about that. I'm worried about the people who are making Article 14 and not getting the producing part of their episodic, the overscale part of their fee, and production is pushed. So, and this is particular to streaming, because maybe they're not going to shoot for 6 months or 7 months. So there's a lot of talk of, okay, well, I'm not going to wait for 7 months. I'm going to go take this other job. But what about the rest of that fee? If I'm not around, do I lose it? And these are the conversations we're having every day. And I think it's unfair. And I get we're all in a weird situation, but it's not fair, especially Patti, a writer at your level with a very healthy episodic fee, to be getting Article 14 weekly and having no idea if you're going to get the rest of your episodic rate. And again, every studio's saying something different. Different people are honoring different things. So I worry about the inconsistency of everything that we have going on in every aspect of our life is inconsistent right now, and we have no idea what's going on. But in terms of guaranteed monies and people having to worry about leaving, am I not going to get my full pay? That's my biggest worry. Is is the shrinking income of writers for what should be deserved and what's earned.
That's our biggest fear too. I'm wondering, can I ask you, Manal, do you think this will cause you to move away from negotiating episodic fees in the future?
Oh, I'm trying so hard to negotiate weekly fees, but of course, we are always trying to guarantee as much guaranteed money as possible, right? Like that's my goal in every negotiation is I want to make sure the guaranteed money is we want to squeeze that as much as we can. So in particular with staffing, we are trying to figure out to go to weekly fees. I think obviously there's a resistance to that. Broadcast is different than streaming. I think span comes into play here too, right? If you're someone who, again, Patti, your level, they probably want you to stay through production. So, 45 an episode is great at 10 episodes, but not if it's at 35 weeks, and so we'll try to, if we will negotiate an episodic fee, we'll try to do a no less than weekly fee. And we are getting a lot of pushback on that. And that goes to leverage again and how bad somebody wants somebody and how much somebody's willing to walk away. But like we're always getting creative to make sure the clients are getting paid. And in this time, we're trying to get as creative as possible. But I think we're getting a lot of pushback from the studios. They're trying to keep the deals standard. And that makes it difficult because so much is unpredicted. I think 4 months ago, would we think we were still here, and so I don't know. So we are trying to figure that out.
Melissa, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I mean, all of these same issues. What I've sometimes been able to do is if a writer gets another job on a new show and they're just in this holding pattern on production, all of their episodes have been written, they're done, basically, until, other than maybe having to do producer polishes during production or be on set if they're even going to be allowed, is kind of getting that options and exclusivity a little bit more lenient from the studios and allowing them, if they know they're going to be working on another series for X number of weeks, especially if it's not that long of a time. I've had some success in allowing writers to work on 2 shows at once, which in the past has been harder to do. So that's kind of one saving grace in all this. I'm also just really hoping production's going to start. It has a little, very little, but it has. So that's a good sign. Right. And apparently lots of shows are going to start producing in LA after Labor Day. So try to stay positive.
Well, and I think that's the big unknowns is that even once we get started, maybe especially once we get started, is what can happen that's going to cause those delays, and the delays that you were talking about, Melissa, where it's like suddenly we're on hiatus, suddenly we're shut down. And
right.
Just because we start doesn't mean we're going to just keep going and it's over. So,
and we're going to take so much longer. Each episode, it's just going to take longer to shoot. That's just the reality.
Right. I mean, I have feelings about the weekly fees, and I think that it's a great protection. It's something that we definitely tried in the NBA to get an option for screenwriters to break their fee into weekly payments so that they could just get paid as they went along. I mean, to me, the big hope of the weekly fees is they ain't making more weeks. We're going to have the same number of weeks every year, and if I know that I'm getting paid every week they want to mess around for whatever reason. If they, I think the downside would be for writers to say, well, what if I've negotiated a weekly rate and they start asking me to do double episodes, just crank out the material? That seems like maybe more of a crew problem, or something like that, something that would affect actors and directors more, that if they had to do something like that, they could actually just shoot more material or make, crappier episodes. I don't know if there's a point where writers can write more I guess I feel like for writers, a weekly fee is probably a pretty solid backstop.
Yeah,
So
agreed.
I
Also
think,
agreed, especially in streaming.
yeah, that seems like one of those collective action things we might need to do. Um, okay, so that's COVID. That's always a cheery subject. How about how about streaming? Streaming specifics. Since so much is moving to streaming, and so many writers, whether they've been working in streaming or not, or will be finding themselves working in streaming, and maybe finding out that what they thought was going to be for something else is now on streaming. I don't know. Every streaming platform has different residuals, different pay scales. Explain.
Sure. So,
And then it says Laurie, Laurie.
yeah, I mean, the first distinction is really ad-supported versus subscription. So ad-supported, obviously, you have to watch ads before they let you watch any programs. The subscription video on demand is where we have our meatiest terms and conditions, meaning what we call SVOD or high budget SVOD. Basically gets treated like television for most purposes. And that if something is made for a advertiser-supported platform, then none of those terms and conditions apply unless it's a derivative program, which is a whole sort of specialized area. So it's really important to know what you're working on. First of all, the platform, and then to qualify as a high-budget SVOD show and get the benefit of those terms, the program needs to be dramatic. So comedy variety doesn't cut it or anything that's non-dramatic. It needs to be at least 20 minutes long. So something made for Quibi, for example, oftentimes is not high budget SVOD, even though the budget might meet the thresholds, which is the third criterion for high budget SVOD. Obviously, it's in the name. In the 2020 agreement, we just negotiated essentially lower budget tiers, which means that more programs will be considered high budget subscription video on demand. The two breaks that have gone down are essentially the 30-minute episode break, and there can be a range of minutes, but around the 30-minute sort of sitcom is down to 1 million per episode from 1.3, and the break for the 60-minute episode is down to 1.7 million from 2.5. So that will collect some more shows that will fit into the high budget, lucrative television-like terms and conditions. The one caveat is that if the company made a license agreement prior to August 2nd, which is our ratification date, then those new budget breaks won't apply to that series. So unfortunately, that exempts shows from the new protections. The SVOD platform subscriber tier, and I think Melissa mentioned this earlier, has an impact on both the script fees and the residuals. So, for example, on Netflix, it's in the highest subscriber tier, meaning it has 45 million or more, which that's the highest, and it has a lot more than that. And this is domestic subscribers, so the United States and Canada. If their budget level meets a certain threshold, then the writer is going to get network primetime fees. On the other hand, if it falls below that tier 1 threshold, then the writer gets basically basic cable script fees. For residuals, being at a high subscriber level also means higher residuals, and Melissa explained a little bit about that earlier. Residuals have those 3 components as part of the formula: the residual base, the subscriber level, and the I'm blanking on the third.
Exhibition year percent.
Yes, the exhibition year. So that all those things come into play, and actually in our schedule of minimums we have that formula laid out, so it's a little bit clearer. Trying to describe it over blue jeans is a little bit tough, but yeah. So I guess I lost my train of thought here. We should be out with our schedule of minimums soon, by the way. We're hoping for next week to have it up on the website. I know people are waiting for that.
Great. And I know we want to make sure that we try to touch on all of these topics before we open it up to the questions, and we could gab about this all night. I don't know if there's any one particular thing, anything we didn't cover on the streaming that somebody really wants to get across. Otherwise, we'll just we're gonna just talk about span under the episode orders a little bit, Laurie, if that's okay. Did anybody have something that they wanted to really drive home on the streaming thing, or should we move to span?
Talk about span.
Yeah.
Span.
Yeah, I mean, span really is a function of mostly the short orders in streaming, but it did start a little bit with basic cable just because things became much less predictable with respect to the start of a new season, the length of the order, whether or not the series would be picked up for the next season. That resulted in both problems with respect to the episodic fees that we've talked about, as well as the options and exclusivity problems, because people were being held for a really long time without being picked up, without being paid. So span basically means that your episodic fee that you negotiate can only cover 2.4 weeks of work. That we tried to basically get back to the place where broadcast television was in the old days, the golden age, I guess, of broadcast television, where each episode took approximately 2 weeks to write and produce. So writers were consistently in the room or on set, and their episodic fee would be spread out over about 2 weeks. So they could predict if they were getting $30,000 an episode, that they would be taking home around $15,000 per week. These days, with short orders, 12 or 10 or whatever, oftentimes there's no particular schedule, so that amount of time that a writer works on an episode can be 5 weeks or even more, which means that ultimately the episodic fee that was $30,000 and that looked like it was going to be $15,000 a week is now really just guild minimum under the writer-producer minimums that we talked about earlier. And so we had very experienced writers being amortized to guild minimum, and that was something that we kept hearing about over the years, and is getting worse with streamers. So we, in 2017, negotiated for the span provision. So the way it works is, if you are getting if you're on a short order series, let's say 10 episodes, and you're getting $30,000 per episode, essentially you're guaranteed $300,000. You're guaranteed $30,000 per episode for 10 episodes. The amount of time that $300,000 can cover is going to be just 24 weeks, because it's 2.4 weeks per episode. So again, there's some predictability there with respect to what you can anticipate getting per week. And if they order additional episodes, or if you work weeks beyond the 24, you'll get another episodic fee. So it was meant to sort of put back that protection. There is a earnings cap for the applicability of span, and we did increase that in the 2020 negotiations to $400,000, $375,000 for basic cable, but that does only impact writers who make contracts dated on or after August 2nd, 2020.
Right. I think on the episode orders, we'll wait and see. I'm sure specific writers have questions that they want to put in the Q&A, and we'll want to make sure that we cover what I know is a hot topic, mini rooms, which it says I'm supposed to say we've all either been in a mini room, I have not, or know friends who have, so let's talk about them. I do know friends who have, and I think I'll go to, Manal and Melissa. I'll say this, the reason I haven't been in the mini room is because when I've been approached and my agent has said, hey, are you interested in a mini room? And I've started asking questions about why I would want to be in one, they quickly say, I don't think you want to be in one. And and it just seems to go away, because apparently my questions are indicating that this sounds like bullshit. So now tell us about mini rooms, and why would your client want to be in one?
I think you ask all the right questions. I think there's different there's different ways to approach it, and the first thing to figure out is, what do you want out of this mini room? Are you trying to squeeze a job in between a hiatus of another show? That's sometimes the scenario. So, hey, let's go work 8 to 10 weeks. If it fits perfectly in timing, you almost can never find a full series. Is this something that you want to be a part of long term? And then deciding those factors decides sort of what you ask for and how you ask for things. If you have no desire to be a part of the series because you are fitting it in between another gig, we just try to make sure you get the best weekly, you get a script guaranteed, hopefully you get a credit depending on how many weeks it is, and you move on. If you want to be a part of the series, then mini rooms are typically weekly fees, so we have to go back to talking about what we talked about before. Okay, what's your episodic fee? How many weeks are you doing this? How much did you make weekly from your episodic fee? So are you at an appropriate increase from where you were before, and doing a little bit of math, because it's trickier when you break it down weekly when you're used to, you're like, oh, 10,000 a week, that's great. And then you were at 30 an episode and you're like, oh, not great. So figuring out how to make sure the appropriate increases for you season over season is something that's really important that we figure out. If you want to be a part of the series, figuring out how long they have an option to pick you up for, to pick up the series is really important. If it's a super short mini room, 6 weeks, they won't contractually give us an out, but are you going to lose out on another job because you're on a 6-week job? These are sort of the approaches that we take when we go at it. So knowing what you want out of it, is it just you just want the mini room gig to fit it in, it fits perfect with timing, or this is something you want to be on long term, is how we approach that. Mm-hmm. Different for everybody in every situation.
Right.
And that actually brings us to our new provision for mini room. I don't know if you want me to mention that, because you just mentioned the option, and that can be the devastating part if a writer only works 6 weeks, but then has to wait 90 days to find out whether they're going to be picked up. That's much longer than they actually work. Right, so we did negotiate a new provision. We don't use the term mini room in this provision. It's in the options and exclusivity, Article 67 of the MBA. And so there's a couple things we did with it. First is we shortened the 90-day hold to 60 for writers who are covered by the provision. But the bigger thing, I guess, the news is that we negotiated this new provision that says for any writer employed for 8 consecutive weeks or less, the company cannot negotiate an option to hold them unless the option is for employment which starts immediately. So that immediately is not defined in our provision, but we're going to say that means tomorrow or very soon, the next week.
Right.
So that will hopefully help the situation where writers are being held 3 times as long as they actually worked without any money. So that's the goal.
Great. Melissa, do you want to talk about issues that can be addressed through negotiations going into mini rooms? Like what's negotiable and what do we have to do to get it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things is that in all of these contracts, there's a provision that says your weekly minimum fees that you're paid in a mini room are going to get credited against your episodic fee later on. I've had some success in eliminating that on certain shows if the writer has enough leverage. Another thing that's important to know, though, is if you can't get that eliminated, so you're getting fresh money for every week that you're working once the larger room starts, is fan does apply to the weeks in the mini room. They're not treated as a separate room. I mean, it's the same series. Then you're going to get those weeks to count, and so you might be owed additional episodic fees based on the amount of weeks you spent in the mini room. So that's something that's important to know. A lot of writers don't realize that, and sometimes the studios aren't, so forthcoming in paying these extra span fees. So it's something to be definitely aware of. Another problem with mini rooms has to do with credits. A lot of times mini rooms, especially the kind that Laurie was just talking about, where they're right before the room opens, you're trying to break a few outlines for the first few episodes, or an outline for the pilot before someone then from the mini room is then picked. to go and write the actual episode on their own. That's something that you really need to be vocal about what happens in the room with your reps to make sure that there isn't a problem where maybe you should be getting credit or at least listed as a participating writer on a notice of tentative writing credit. So maybe you can get some credit on the episode. If you feel like you contributed in a meaningful way in a room, tell your reps, they'll contact the guild, and we'll make sure that, we fight to get your names listed as a participating writer.
Great. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be questions in the Q&A. We could spend a lot of time on that. I would also say that I've got lots of questions on what new showrunners can do when they're told that, for example, that they want to pick it up, but here's how you do it. We'd have to have a mini room. You have to do this and that, and how much a showrunner can try to push back, especially if they feel like their shot at getting a show made is dependent on them utilizing a mini room that they don't even feel is that valuable, perhaps. But that's for another night. We'll do that some other time. Separated rights. This is separated rights has been like this thing my entire career that is like I keep hearing about these separated rights, and then like it's incomprehensible. So Laurie, talk us through separated rights.
Okay, well, the concept is simple. A writer has separated rights when they write an original story with original characters. That's the short description.
And when does that happen?
Well, almost all of it. I mean, a lot of times. When it's not, Marvel or something. So this applies to material whether it's written for theatrical motion picture, television, or HBSVOD, WSVOD. The term itself, and that's why I think that's what confuses most people. It comes from the concept that in the U.S., the studio is the author for copyright purposes and owns the copyright. So the term separated rights means certain rights are separated out from the bundle of rights that the studio has and effectively given back to the writer of the original material. It's a way to compensate the writer for not having the copyright, which in any other country in the world they probably would have if they created something original. In television and new media, it's generally the writer who writes the format for the series who has the separated rights. So the format is essentially defined as the central running characters, their characterizations, the framework in which they operate from episode to episode, etc. So that is really the crux of who will have separated rights, and that person will generally have a created by credit, and that credit will appear on every episode as a continuing credit. In addition, that writer will get a sequel payment, an episodic series sequel payment, we call it, for every episode produced based on that original format. So the other part of separated rights is the trickier part, in a sense, and that is what we call the reserved rights. So in the old days, when you had playwrights writing for live television, essentially they retained almost all the rights. There was a limited right to use it for that one live production, and then the writer retained everything else. And so the concept of reserved rights comes from there. It's essentially everything else, everything that's not the use on television or new media is a reserved right, the right to do publications, merchandise, or even a theatrical motion picture. One thing to look out for, and I know we wanted to talk about pilot deals, is oftentimes the writer will acquire or seek to acquire the writer's reserved rights by paying what's known as the upset price. And that is essentially a higher minimum for the pilot script that allows them to basically buy out your rights. And oftentimes that's what happens. And you'll notice, and this is one thing to look for when you're doing a pilot deal, is a separated rights agreement or an upset price agreement. And oftentimes the consideration is pretty nominal that they'll pay you for those rights. And they can be very valuable. It's often along the lines of $100. So, if you have leverage to try to fight against that, or at least try to get some money if the company exploits any of those rights, that is something we encourage writers to do. And please call us if you're in that situation in the contracts department. Hopefully that explains a little bit about what it is. Is it any clearer?
It's always going to be a mystery. Only because I've never been able to go out and either fight for or get or invoke my reserved rights. So someday I'm going to get them.
It's pretty tough.
Yeah.
It's
Melissa,
it's like a bird in the hand versus two in the bush if you want that pilot deal. So I understand.
right. Is there anything that you want to add, either Manal or Melissa, about what you can negotiate? What else is negotiable in terms of those? Someone's like, good luck.
Not too much that's negotiable when it comes to separated rights. I mean, for the most part, you're going to be paid like $100 for the upset fee, but you will get more in compensation too. There's a certain portion of your fee that is required if they're going to be paying the upset price in addition to that $100. I mean, there's certain rights that Laurie mentioned that are protected, that you get to retain even if the upset price is paid. So you have, especially in television, you have the ability later on to then go and produce your pilot if it was never made originally and just sat on a shelf forever. Or you can try to reacquire your rights.
I was going to say the revision on those, right? There's a like after 4 years. Yeah. So also, a lot of people don't realize that is you can get the rights back. So understand. Or go ahead, Laurie.
Well, yes, but so you can get, if they don't produce the pilot, you can get the rights in the television and new media rights back, but it's those reserved rights that might cause a problem, because if the company did acquire those in perpetuity, you're talking about a situation where the writer can run with the television rights and set the series up elsewhere, but there's still the matter of those other rights, which probably the new studio is going to want to get. And they can, it's just, they'll have to bargain for it.
Yeah, a lot of times they do barter. They'll trade because they all have so many scripts just sitting on shelves that if they want to move forward with a project, they'll give something else up that they know the other studio wanted, and usually they're able to work it out. If you find someone who actually wants to make your project, and even if another studio owns the rights, it usually can happen.
Right. They've got us all on little baseball cards there.
Yeah, exactly.
It does give the writer leverage, even if they've sold their reserved rights, because they have that reversion. They can set it up elsewhere.
Okay, great. So we have kind of one more area that we're going to talk about. So just going to let everybody who's listening know to make sure you post your questions in the Q&A. Not in the chat, the Q&A, and then if you see a question that you were going to ask, go ahead and like it, so that'll help it rise to the top, so we answer the questions that people have most, and you should really start doing that now. We're going to just talk about development. We started to touch on that a little bit, about things to look out for when negotiating a pilot deal.
I'll jump in. Obviously, what's a fair fee, what's, that ranges based on your experience, what you've sold before, how competitive it is. I feel like exclusivity is super important. A studio won't want you working on anything, and then is that through post on a show? Is that, there's a lot of details in there, is how you can work on something, when you can work on something, how long they can restrict you from working with something. That is something I feel like we're fighting and talking through all the time, especially with how long it takes for things to get made. So like outside dates are also really, once you've delivered a pilot script or whatever it is you're delivering, how long do they have to decide to move forward, and how long are they holding you? So that's super important. Everything else, to me, feels pretty standard. I'm sure I'm missing something, but I feel like that's like the big one, is everybody wants to tie you down to them, and you as a writer, it's a numbers game, right? Most things don't get made, unfortunately. So you want to be able to keep earning. So that's one very, very, very important thing, is to understand how and how long and what you can work on while you're working on a development project.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, starting with, after you deliver the pilot, how long they have to decide if they're going to produce the pilot. Then even if the pilot's going to produce, how long they have to decide if they're going to pick it up to series. One thing that is good to try to do, and Sony actually tends to allow this, is try to not be held exclusive until the series has actually been picked up. That's pretty standard for Sony to allow that. Some of the other studios, you got to fight for that a lot harder, but that allows you more flexibility in terms of finding other work. Things that should always be in your pilot deal, your pilot producing fee, it should be higher than your episodic fee. Usually about 25% higher, because the pilot is going to involve a lot more work. And the studios will try to make it uniform. They're going to try to pay you just the same amount across the board. So you need to make sure your rep goes after that. Series sales bonus, it's usually standard $25,000 if you get sole credit, 12.5 if you share. MAGR, this is where your back end is going to be negotiated. Different studios are different. Some of them like to wait until the long form to negotiate the details of MAGR. Some of them do it, up front. This is an area that's probably the most esoteric for writers, and they know the least about. So relying on your reps for MAGR is really important. There's going to be a royalty fee. Whether or not you have a lock. Sometimes you have a 2-year lock if your episode gets picked up, if your project gets picked up, and you have sole credit on it. So try to get a 2-year. They call it the 2-year Warner lock. Customary derivatives. So if there's a spinoff of your project, you want to make sure that there's something in your deal terms that addresses that. You want to have the first opportunity to do the writing on the spinoff or remake or whatever the derivative winds up being. And if you don't get that, you want to try to negotiate for 50% of your royalty. Sometimes they try to make it 25% for a planted spinoff, but try to make it 50 across the board. If you think you're going to wind up being the showrunner, having a logo card. A consultant fee, that's when you actually leave the show. You want to try to have it be 1-to-1. So every year that you work on the series, you're going to get paid a consultant fee per episode when you leave. So it's just purely passive money. I mean, you have to be reasonably available to provide advice and consult, but sometimes you'll get called one time a year and you're still getting paid, $10,000 to $20,000 per episode just for this, passive work. I think that covers most of the main points. I don't know if anyone.
I was going to say, it's amazing how many times they'll conveniently forget the series sales bonus, or they'll conveniently forget the consulting fee. So you have to make sure you pay attention to those details, the standard details that should be coming in every development deal, because they'll forget to put it. They'll forget to put it in. Yeah, and you'll be like, oh, you forgot the consulting fee, and they're like, oh, wow. So those are the two that I see conveniently get forgotten the most.
One thing I would throw in from an enforcement perspective is something, I just wanted to flag this, something that pilot writers are often forced to do, which is something called a series document or a series overview. And oftentimes, because writers are very anxious to have their pilot produced or maybe the series picked up, they're asked to do this document, which can be very detailed, that is essentially a format, as I described earlier. That's up the framework, perhaps the storyline for each episode for the first season even. This is something that oftentimes writers are not compensated for. And so I would really urge writers, if they're being asked to do that, particularly if there's no agreement to pay them for it, that they contact the Guild, either legal or contracts, about that, because we've been hearing more about that. I wanted to throw that out there.
That's a good question. I think too is that if since there are provisions in the MBA, long-standing provisions for what writers get paid for formats for Bibles and things like that, if the expectation is like, well, that's in the MBA and it doesn't need to be in my contract, or presumably it doesn't in order to enforce it.
Absolutely.
But what are there any recommendations for how to address that even before you kind of get into working?
It's so difficult just because I just want people to be aware of it and know what their rights are, because I think writers want so much for their pilot to go to series or be picked up, and I understand that. But it's no fault of the writers if the guild wants to enforce these minimums. So that's why I would just suggest calling that so that we can investigate.
Yeah, I agree. Melissa, did you have something?
Yeah, my dogs just ran in, so I apologize to everyone if they start barking. I was going to say, in terms of defining sole credit, most things are based on sole credit. A lot of these perks you get in your pilot deal, like the lock, for instance, or your royalty, you're going to get it more if you get sole credit. If you wind up having a writing partner, or your work is based on underlying IP, make sure you define sole credit to include any shared credit with the co-writer, or if the underlying IP writer, winds up getting credit too, because that's something they can sneak in right by you, and they'll give it to you if you ask.
I think one thing to add too is there are certain studios that will do reductions based on where something is set up, and which means all the numbers you negotiate will be like 25% lower. So I think it's important to have them define which places which places they count as the tier 1 and which places they count as the tier 2. And I think a lot of people don't realize that some of those you can negotiate, or they'll be like, oh yeah, we'll put that in tier 1. So that's something, obviously we hate anybody to be in a situation where they're reduced from the numbers we negotiate. So we try to make sure that we define all the places that count for each. And so that's something really important to look out for, and a detail that I think gets overlooked sometimes.
That's
right,
a good
great.
point. Especially Hulu. They keep trying to make Hulu. They're treating it like it's basic cable and tier 2, and their budgets are the same as Netflix or any of these tier 1 projects. That it really pisses me off when I see Hulu as tier 2. So just look out for that one.
Always some new bad guy in town. And just I think I just want to circle back, because I think we started off with talking about minimums and not being able to, it's not legal to negotiate below them. Is there anything in which you're not allowed to negotiate more than what our minimums are?
I would say pension and health contribution, because that is governed by some other laws in addition to just what we can negotiate.
Correct.
Can't think of anything else, though.
All right, so we can ask for more on anything, and if you ever hear the words that's not negotiable because it's guild minimum, you can say, no, that's why it's called minimum.
You always ask for more on everything. If the worst you're going to get is no. But if you don't ask, you're not going to get.
Great. Okay, so I think we're ready to open it up to the questions. So Deb, you're going to read the questions for us?
Yeah, Doug and I will do that. So I'll ask the first question. This has the most likes. After signing an if-come deal, how many rounds of producer notes does a writer need to do on a pitch they won't be paid for until if there is a buyer? It feels like after signing the if-come deal, the writer loses all creative leverage.
I don't, that's not mandated by the WGA. So if-come deals are tough, they're very common for broadcast development. That's where we like to keep them because the turnaround will be quicker because of the way the timing works there. They obviously happen in other situations. But that's a tough one, because I think Laurie made the point of you want to do everything you can to sell it so you get paid. So I think that when we have clients in this situation, it's different if you have multiple people to choose from, but try to have go with your gut. Like, who do you feel is a creative partner that gets this project, so you're not getting stuck in this endless cycle? I think that's really important. I guess it's like that's not something that's mandated. That's just something that you as a writer, if you're going through a tremendous amount of producer notes to get to a pitch and you've made a deal, there's something creatively not on the same page there. You've pitched the project, they've done a deal. It feels like you should be in the ballpark of with the creative, to not have to go through that, but again, every situation's different. So I think that's just a gut check of, okay, does this person get what this is? And hopefully you don't have to spin your wheels, doing that over and over, which essentially is free work unless you set it up.
And really, honestly, there probably is something compensable there. That's an area where we can look into who is asking you to write and what are you writing, because there may very well be a minimum that applies to that. I realize again that the situation is tricky and you're trying to collaborate and you're trying to get this thing set up, but abuse is abuse, and we can help with that most likely.
Also, I will say that if you're feeling creatively taken advantage, call your agent, right? That's also our job, is call the producer and be like, hey, what's going on? Like the writer's feeling burnt out, like what happened? We thought we had a match here. That's where I think we can be really good at sort of being the middleman for you, so you don't have to feel frustrated with a creative partner. Let us kind of be the jerks that bring that up and be like, let's go, let's get going. What's going on?
Great. So Debbie, you just gonna go. What's our next most popular question?
Okay, I will take that one. This one's from Anonymous. My reps have told me that as a staff writer, I have no leverage until I am mid-level. Is that true?
No.
I think that's false, because if you are a staff writer and multiple people want to hire you, you have leverage. I think that you can be an upper level writer and have no leverage in a certain situation. You could be a mid-level writer and have no leverage in a situation. I think leverage can be created at any level. Leverage usually happens when you have multiple options and can walk away and somebody's going to lose you. So I have seen it and have been involved in it at every level, including someone who is pre-WGA and selling something and multiple places wanted it. And we had leverage and were able to get much higher standard numbers than typically you would get at that level. So I think that's false. I think it depends on the situation. It depends on, it just depends on the situation. It could be at any level.
Yeah, and even if you're just, even if you don't have that much leverage, there's still things that can be negotiated at the staff writer level, especially related to options and exclusivity, making it so you're allowed to develop, especially starting year 2. And also normally these deals are multi-year deals, so you might be a staff writer your first year, but then your second year you're going to be a story editor, and that's when it's easier to negotiate for guaranteed script commitments and things like that. So I think, yeah, I agree with Manal. It's at any level you have to negotiate, and you can.
Great. Yeah, I would have to say again, I think Manal had said it before, if you don't ask, then asking is leverage, because they have to give you an answer, and the answer might be no, but how many times do they want to say no? And maybe there's something they can say yes to and get it over with. So ask for everything.
Yeah, sometimes you get surprised, a lot of times we'll ask and the answer's no. And we'll know that, but if somebody wants a writer bad enough, I have seen things happen that they say could never happen.
I've seen that too. Sometimes it's really bad. But we'll keep a good thought. So what's our next question?
Okay, so next question is also from Anonymous. I've been on shows where my 20-week contract expires, but I've been assigned an episode to write that we haven't finished breaking. So they asked me to stay on and keep writing the episode, even though contract is not extended, saying I'm now freelance and the script fee is enough. Is that allowed?
No.
No, that's kind of what I was talking about in the hiatus scenario that we're seeing a lot with COVID, but it applies even outside the COVID context. If you're on staff, you get paid your weekly fee. And in fact, if your 20-week guarantee runs up, you get paid at the higher rate, the week-to-week rate, unless they up you for, another certain amount of week guarantee where they'd get a discount. So, yeah, you get paid your weekly, and it's not like when you get sent home to write on your own that you're not part of the staff anymore.
Yeah, this is really something to work out for with COVID.
Keep your reps in the loop on that, because you have to let us know that that's happening so we can go and advocate for that, and make sure you're getting paid for those extra weeks, including if you were on set and producing and working on post with the showrunner. If you were in the office and you were working, you should get paid for that. So it's really important to make sure if you go over your guaranteed time to let us know that that's happening, so we can let the guild know, and we can contact the studio and say, hey, you owe them an extra 2 weeks.
Right, and that goes for everybody on staff. So if anybody's writing, everybody should be getting paid. So it goes to more than just the individual, it's the whole writing staff.
Right. All right, what else does Anonymous have for us? They're having a hard time. Let's hear more.
All right. This question comes from Anonymous. I was told by my lawyer that I shouldn't allow the guild to get my contract by default under the new agency terms. They said it would mean I'd be held responsible for dues on pay over scale or producer income. Not that I believe them, but is there a way for the guild to separate out producer income?
Okay, that's
Sorry, just
really
to
not
clarify,
true.
that's a dues. They're asking a dues question as far as how to separate out what's duesable. Is that right?
You don't pay dues on your producer money anyway. You pay it on your Article 14 money. So that lawyer, that's just completely false.
Get a new lawyer, Anonymous.
Right.
Yeah. I would say definitely so. And any lawyer who's telling you that, the dues has nothing to do with your contract on the show, and that's ludicrous. And I think you should report that lawyer. I think you should stop being anonymous and report that lawyer to the guild, because I think that they might be shady.
And another thing is, if you're working on a series, we get work lists from the studio, so we know if you've been working on a series too. So nothing is being hidden from us in terms of that Article 14 money that is duesable. By not giving us your contract, it's not like anything is being hidden from the guild in terms of dues in that respect.
Bad lawyer. What else?
All right, so the next question.
Another question.
Oh, yeah, also from Anonymous. Will the guild continue to negotiate for writers once the agency action is officially over? Please keep this option open, in brackets.
And I think that means Melissa and the legal side.
It's something we've definitely discussed, and that we want to keep having that be a service that we offer. We're getting closer to hopefully the end of the agency campaign, where we can put more attention into that and what our long-term plan is. But we've had a really positive reaction from the membership to the service we've been offering, and we want to keep doing it.
Me too. Great. I hope everybody's given a big thumbs up to that question. Deb, do we have the next question?
Yeah, I've got the next one here. This one comes from Andrew Gettins. He asks,
hey, Andrew, way to go on the record.
He asks, it's common these days for studios to withhold part of your paycheck until long-form contract is signed, i.e., they pay you scale for months until your long-form deal comes through. My question is, 1, is this legal? And 2, what can we do to stop this practice?
They withhold 10%. They don't stick to scale, is my understanding. Am I totally wrong about that, Laurie?
Well, they can't pay less than scale. That for sure, no matter what. And then we would probably try to see, is that something that you agree to? I mean, so overscale is subject to whatever the parties have agreed to. So I'm guessing they probably didn't put it in your deal terms that they were going to withhold that. That's something that we would look at to see whether they could do that. So that's the best thing, is to come to the guild and let us know so that we can investigate and see whether that's justified or not, particularly if it puts you below minimum.
We actually have claims pending in legal right now on this exact issue about withholding the 10%. So we are pursuing that in it of itself as a problem. So definitely reach out to us. I think that you might have been thinking of two separate issues. With minimum, normally you get paid minimum until the episodes are actually produced, and then you wind up getting the balance of your episodic fee, but that's totally unrelated to having your contract executed. Really, the practice in the industry is that they can't withhold more than 10%, but we don't even, as the guild, think they can do that.
Great. Okay, now I don't know if it's going to be Doug or Deb. I'm on pins and needles. Who's asking the next question?
It's going to be me.
Yay.
Okay, so this one is, pulling it up. Sorry. What can a low-level writer reasonably expect for back end on a development deal and any other standard terms on a series? And how is that different if the project is based on IP that's not yours versus original work? And where can I find the contract average data that Melissa spoke about?
You can reach out to us, call the legal department. Our main number is 323-782-4521 for the agency department or the contracts department. I don't know their extension numbers offhand, but we can share that with you. It's also posted on the Guild's website. We probably have a more detailed breakdown than what's posted, and I know we're going to be updating that information, but give us a call and we can definitely share that with you. I mean, it really just, I can't answer generally what can a low-level writer on their first pilot deal expect. There's a lot of factors and variables that come into play with that in terms of, do you have someone else attached? And if it's based on IP, that really shouldn't mean that you're getting paid less, though. Sometimes the studios try to say that, and especially with MAGR, they're like, oh, well, we gave it all to, Stephen King, so we don't have any more points for you. Not true, they do. So, I mean, maybe you won't get as much as someone that's a seasoned pilot writer, but there's definitely room you should get a good deal, and we have that data.
And I think, again, there's a lot of variables. Is it competitive? Are you going in with somebody, a big producer? I think for us, again, this is where, comparing what we know what people get, we know at what studio what is fair for somebody who's new to development, and what is fair for somebody who's had 5 things sold. So that's, again, where it's really important to have a good rep and talk that out and talk about expectations. I like to talk about expectations when it's a first-time development deal. Well, what do you think you should get? What do you want? This is what I think is fair based on the other deals that we've done most recently at your level, and talking it out that way. And sometimes you get surprised and you get higher, and sometimes it's a little bit lower. So, but I think talking that out with your rep is really asking them, what's your experience? What should we be getting? And again, there's a lot of variables. You can't ever say, you never know that for sure, but it's our job to fight for what we know is pay parity at a minimum, at your level, at that studio.
Right, great. Yeah, I think if you're worried about losing an opportunity, there'll always be an opportunity to get taken advantage of in Hollywood. So don't worry that turning that down is not going to lead to they'll come back with another opportunity to work for free. So what's our next question?
All right, I've got this one, comes from Anonymous again. I want to know why we're not able to own any portions of our shows we create, like show creators in the UK or Canada. When I asked my lawyer about this, she says it's because of the financial interest and syndication rule, which strips artists of creative rights. But some people have ownership. Why is this?
It actually has to do with the copyright law, and there's something called the work for hire doctrine in the United States. I don't want to bore you with all the legalese, but in Europe, they don't have that. So in the US, when you wind up working as a work for hire, which is what writers do, there's a transfer of the copyright. In Europe, they don't have that, and instead, writers are paid remuneration payments for, every time their show is aired, just based on their copyright laws. So it really comes down to a difference in copyright distinction.
And by the way, we get some of that in the form of foreign levies too. That's a function of those payments that they make.
But our members are a lot better than the European writers. So
yeah, and that's where separated rights comes in. It's a function of the weirdness of our work for hire doctrine here. And so ownership, separated rights does give you control over how to exploit the material in some ways. Another way that a writer might have ownership is by owning part of the production company. That happens sometimes with more independent production.
Great. Okay, so what's our next question? Is it anonymous?
I will take the next one. It is anonymous. Can you talk about what one should look out for as a first-time creator, parentheses, original material, not based on IP, specifically if you know a showrunner will be bought in, or if a showrunner will be brought in as a first-time creator?
Yeah, that's always a tough one because when it's your first script, it's very personal. It's your first pilot, and then you lose a lot of control if you know that there's going to be a showrunner that's going to be brought on for the series. I mean, maybe you have control over the pilot, but a lot of times the showrunner is going to take a pass at even the pilot, and you'll wind up sharing credit. I think you just have to be aware going into that if they are attaching a big name showrunner, the studio that's shopping it is probably doing that because that's how it's going to sell better. And you're also going to be learning. It's very hard to say you're going to broadcast and you are stuck to a very tight schedule with 22 episodes. It's really hard as a writer who's never, been in the who's never run a show to be running a broadcast show. So I think it's just kind of being realistic with what that actually means. There are certain protections that you can, ask for meaningful consultation rights in your contract to make sure that you have certain assurances. Try to get it to be a co-showrunner. You should get an EP credit, hopefully, not be reduced down to a co-EP. So at least you're one of the top people that's going to be on the project, but you have to know going in if there's going to be another showrunner attached. It's not completely your show anymore.
I think I've seen some deals recently, like people first time developing, you're already on the low end of back end because it's probably your first contract. So watch out. I've seen some studios try to sneak in reductions for a showrunner when it's so obvious that they're going to have a showrunner. So it's take that out, come on, they're already on the low end. So it's little details like that where it's if you know a showrunner is going to come in and they're going to try to reduce, and they'll say if a showrunner is coming in, we're going to reduce. Just be we know we're going to get a showrunner. Can we do better than this? This is a disingenuous reduction because we know there's going to be a showrunner. So it's little details. Everybody does it a little different, but that's one I've seen recently.
And make sure you know from creative. If it's your first pilot, you want to know what the expectation is from creative. Is that their intention to hire a showrunner? You don't want to be blindsided. A lot of times, especially the streamers, people are able to become showrunners earlier on because you aren't stuck to those tight schedules as much. And I think it's just really important to have that conversation with creative because that's not something that your lawyer or your agent, maybe your agent, but your lawyer's not going to know that when they're dealing with business affairs because the business affairs people aren't going to know that either. We can communicate with business affairs to find those answers, but definitely go in with eyes wide open.
I would add, knowing when, if the answer is yes, is being very clear that you want to be part of that process, and you want to find somebody that's a partner, and who is going to respect that you created the show and come in and be your partner, versus somebody who's going to come in and take over. Now, of course, you never know what the relationship is going to be like when you're in there and if it's a creative match, but I mean, being very upfront that you would like to be a part of that process as much as they'll allow you.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I would say also, I think I've heard, and it's kind of a little bit outside the purview of talking about people's contracts, but a lot of concerns from new writers who are doing development or being asked to do development, and being taken advantage of and almost being used to get sort of a first pass of something where they're going to bring somebody else in if it's actually going to go. And honestly, for me as a guild member and for me as an upper level writer, it's not fair to either side. It's not fair to bring on a showrunner and then try to tell the showrunner that you're a consultant or that you're just getting some kind of supervisory fee when actually the expectation is to do writing. So it's not good on either end. And I think across the board, we have to be more supportive of the creative process and of the writer who's creating something, and that you're not going to shortchange us on both sides. So again, probably not a lot of contract language that goes into that, but it's definitely an issue, I think, for writers. Deb or Doug?
Yep, okay. So got another anonymous question. If you have a contract where it's for under 400K, under what circumstances do you still have to watch out for span protection? For example, companies used to have to pay extra dollars to get the threshold where span wasn't covered by the MBA. Was this loophole closed in the 2020 MBA?
Yes.
So
thank you for asking that question. It was something that we used to call it stand by up. Now the formal terminology after these negotiations was topping off, where if you were close to the threshold, the studios, especially ABC, would have language in the contract where they reserve the option to just pay you the difference instead of having to pay span if it turns out you work more than the weeks that they anticipated initially you were going to work. We negotiated that away in the 2020 negotiations. They get a year where they're still allowed to engage in this topping off practice, but after that it is done. So
yes,
you won't be in that language anymore.
The specific agreement is that only episodic fees will count when determining whether a writer meets the threshold. That's essentially the language of the unpublished side letter that we have now.
Right.
What date is that, Laurie? When does that start?
May 2nd, 2021. So, and that pertains to contracts made on or after that date. So if you have one now that's subject to a renewal next year, you still might not get the benefit of that, unfortunately.
All right. Mark your calendars.
Yeah.
May 2nd. Okay.
Make a new contract.
Great. So do we have time for, I'm not sure how late we're going. Do we have time for more questions?
Yeah, we've got one last question here. Let's see. We've got from Christina Walker, who says, I've never had a contract prior to starting on day one in the writer's room. Each time my agent is pointing to the studio saying that they're dragging their feet. How are we supposed to push back on this? Each day we miss on the room, we're falling behind.
Well, you should have signed a C of A before that. Are we talking about long form contract? I guess we should clarify that. But like, there's something you should have signed before this. And but a long form typically takes longer. That's just, it is what it is. The deal memo, the C of A, like you will sign that. You should sign that. You should not start. Your rep should not want you to start, and the studio typically does not want you to start until you sign that.
Yeah, and it's
But payment is due.
we can enforce a deal memo. It is a contract. I mean, you'll have a long form later that will have more comprehensive terms, but we can enforce the material terms of a deal memo. So it's not like you're without a contract. I think that a lot of writers don't realize that because the deal memos they don't actually sign. It's your reps have the authority to act on your behalf, and so it is a binding contract.
And don't forget that the MBA is also a binding contract, and that doesn't require you to have any agreement in order for us to enforce payments. So our minimum terms are enforceable from the get-go, right away.
Great. And I know there's also a lot of information on the Guild's website about the late pay campaign, particularly for TV writers, about the paperwork that you need, making sure you get the paperwork that you need to get payments started so that there's nobody saying, oh, but it's the writer's fault because they didn't sign some paperwork. So you can contact the Guild about that as well and make sure that you get your start paperwork in a timely manner. So, okay. I think that's all we have time for. This was great, you guys. I'm a strong believer in the axis of evil. My lawyer, my my agent, and my Guild. So I hope I answered all of Anonymous's questions, and I wish them luck.